In 2014, Vladimir Putin took Crimea in less than 4 weeks. No formal declaration of war, no sustained military campaign, just unmarked soldiers appearing in strategic locations, a parliament seized, infrastructure locked down, and before Ukraine or the West could organize a coherent response, it was done. A peninsula the size of Maryland, gone, absorbed, claimed. Putin called it sacred Russian land. He called it an inseparable part of Russia. He called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And that last description was not poetic exaggeration. Whoever controls Crimea controls the Black Sea, controls the projection of military power into the Mediterranean, controls trade routes, energy resources, and the strategic geography of an entire region. Putin understood all of that in 2014, which is why he moved so fast. And here is what he did not understand. He did not understand that Ukraine would spend the next 12 years methodically, patiently, and systematically dismantling everything he built there. He did not understand that the peninsula he seized in 4 weeks would become the terrain on which his war would ultimately be decided. And he did not understand, he could not have, that in 2026, a retired United States Army Lieutenant General would look at the state of the battlefield and say clearly, calmly, and without qualification, that big bridge is eventually going to come down. I'm Flash America, and what I'm about to walk you through is the most important strategic development in the Ukraine war right now. Not what is happening in Donetsk, not what is happening in Kherson, what is happening in Crimea. Because if Ukraine's current campaign succeeds, and every piece of evidence right now suggests it will, the war will never look the same again. To understand why Crimea matters so much and why what Ukraine is doing there right now is so significant, you need to go back to what Russia actually built on the peninsula after 2014. Crimea was not just a territorial acquisition for Putin. It was the foundation of his entire military strategy for projecting power in the region. Through the port city of Sevastopol, Russia's Black Sea Fleet gained its most important home base, a position from which it could threaten Ukraine's southern coast, project power toward the Mediterranean, and maintain influence across trade routes that have been contested for centuries. The surrounding waters are rich in oil and gas. The airfields on the peninsula gave Russia launch capabilities across a massive geographic arc. And the Crimean Bridge, the $4 billion structure that Putin personally opened in 2018, connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland across the Kerch Strait, became the logistical backbone of everything Russia built there. When Russia prepared its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Crimea was where it funneled the troops, munitions, and equipment that would be used to hammer Ukraine's southern regions in the opening days of the war. When Russia needed to resupply forces fighting along the southern front lines, Crimea was the staging point. When Russia's Black Sea Fleet needed a home, Sevastopol was where it docked. Putin did not just annex a piece of land in 2014, he built a military fortress. And he was absolutely certain, in the way that men who never face consequences tend to be certain, that he had secured it for generations. He was wrong. From the very first day of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's commanders made one thing clear. The liberation of Crimea was not a dream or a long-term aspiration, it was an objective, and they were going to back that statement up with action. They did not wait long. Within months of the invasion, the first attacks began. Ukrainian drone crews started targeting the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Explosions rocked the Crimean Bridge. The message was unmistakable. Even while defending hundreds of miles of front line in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson, Ukraine was making Crimea as dangerous as possible for Russian forces to occupy. And then the strikes kept coming. Warships were sunk at the Sevastopol naval base. Storm Shadow cruise missiles wiped Russian fortifications from the map. Russian aircraft were destroyed on the ground by kamikaze drones. Air defense systems that Russia relied on to protect the peninsula were eliminated one by one. The Crimean Bridge was struck in 2022, struck again in July 2023, struck a third time in June 2025. Some of these attacks were relatively contained. Others were historic. In September 2023, Operation Crabtrap sent a salvo of Storm Shadow missiles directly into the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters building in Sevastopol, reportedly killing more than 30 officers and wounding over 100 additional servicemen in a single strike. But here's the thing you need to understand about all of these attacks. They were not random. They were not isolated provocations. They were not Ukraine venting frustration. Every single strike was part of a deliberate, long-term strategy. Ukraine was not trying to reconquer Crimea overnight. It was doing something more sophisticated than that. It was methodically stripping away Russia's ability to defend the peninsula, eliminating air defenses, destroying ammunition stockpiles, sinking ships, degrading radars, so that when the moment finally came to press the decisive advantage, Russia would have nothing left to stop it. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who served in the United States Army for nearly 40 years and commanded U.S. Army forces in Europe, described what Ukraine has been building toward in a recent appearance on the Times radio podcast Frontline, The War in Ukraine and Global Security. His assessment was direct. I still believe, as I did since the beginning, that Crimea is the decisive terrain of the war. Not one of the important terrains, the decisive terrain. Let's talk about why Hodges said that, because it gets to the heart of what is at stake here. Crimea's value to Russia is both strategic and symbolic. On the strategic side, Hodges noted explicitly, the ability to project power across the Black Sea really comes from Crimea. The airfields, the naval base, the radar installations, the geographic position that turns the Black Sea from a shared waterway into a Russian lake. If Ukraine were able to recapture the peninsula and regain control of its ports and airfields, it would fundamentally change the military balance not just in the Black Sea, but across the wider region. On the symbolic side, the stakes are even higher for Putin personally. He has called Crimea sacred. He has called it an inseparable part of Russia. He has built his political identity, at home to his own people, around the narrative that Russia reclaimed its rightful land in 2014 and will never give it up. Losing Crimea would not just be a military setback, it would be an ideological collapse, a public admission that everything he built the last decade of his political career on was wrong. Hodges believes that Ukrainian President Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi are both fully aware of this. They know what Crimea represents. They have it near the top of their objective list. And while Hodges does not believe a direct ground assault on the peninsula is necessary or imminent, he expects the sustained campaign of targeted strikes on airfields, air defenses, and critical infrastructure to continue accelerating. And he made one statement about the Crimean Bridge that deserves to be heard clearly. That big bridge is eventually going to come down. Not might come down, not could come down, is going to come down. To understand why that statement carries so much weight, you need to understand what the Crimean Bridge actually represents logistically. Not symbolically, logistically. Russia has established a land bridge to Crimea by occupying enough of Ukraine's southern territories to create an overland supply corridor. But that route runs close to the front lines, making it vulnerable to Ukrainian drone strikes, missile attacks, and artillery. Every convoy that takes that route is a potential target. And Ukraine's drones are constantly scanning. Once a pattern is identified, the strike follows. The Crimean Bridge, spanning the Kerch Strait, has been Russia's safer option. Fuel, weapons, ammunition, military equipment, all of it moving across that $4 billion structure from the Russian mainland into Crimea and on to southern frontline positions. It is the logistical backbone of Russia's military presence on the peninsula, and Ukraine has already proven 3 times that it can hit it. It struck the bridge in 2022 with a truck bomb, again in July 2023, again in June 2025. Each time, Russia was forced to shut it down for emergency repairs. Each time, the damage was eventually patched. But Ukraine's capabilities in 2026 are significantly more advanced than they were in 2022. Its drones and missiles are more powerful, more precise, and more numerous. The prospect of a 4th strike, one severe enough to send entire sections of the bridge into the water below, is not a theoretical possibility. It is an active planning question. If the bridge falls, every Russian soldier remaining in Crimea is cut off. No safe escape route to the mainland. No uninterrupted flow of fuel and ammunition from Krasnodar Krai. The troops that remain become exactly what Ukraine has been slowly engineering them to become: isolated, undersupplied, and unable to defend a peninsula they can no longer receive reinforcements for. And Ukraine is not waiting for the bridge to fall before pressing its advantage. The campaign to isolate Crimea is already underway, and it is accelerating. On the night of April 5th, Ukraine's defense intelligence confirmed that special units from the Department of Active Operations used drones to disable the Russian railway ferry Slavyanin. This was the last railway ferry operating across the Kerch Strait. Let me put that in context. Those ferries had been serving as a supplementary supply line, moving military equipment and ammunition across the water to Russian forces in Crimea. With the Slavyanin disabled, every single railway ferry crossing the Kerch Strait has now been destroyed, damaged, or put out of service by Ukrainian operations. Russia is now forced to funnel even more traffic across the Crimean Bridge, which makes that bridge an even more valuable and more visible target. But Ukraine did not stop there. Over the course of a week-long campaign in April, Ukrainian forces carried out a series of strikes along the critical land corridor linking Russia and Crimea through occupied southern Ukraine. 3 Russian arsenals were targeted and damaged. 3 separate supply depots were struck. 2 logistics hubs coordinating the flow of supplies along the corridor were hit. Ukraine is not just attacking the bridge. It is attacking every road, every depot, every coordination point that feeds into it. And then on April 20th, reports emerged of Ukrainian defense forces striking 2 of Russia's large landing ships stationed in Sevastopol Bay. The 2 vessels were the Project 775 Yamal and the Project 1171 Nikolai Filchenkov. The Yamal was capable of transporting up to 500 tons of cargo, including armored vehicles and troops, and is valued at over $80 million. The Nikolai Filchenkov is larger still, with a maximum capacity of around 1,000 tons, giving it the ability to ferry a substantial landing force across the water. Older than the Yamal and valued at approximately $70 million, it was nonetheless a significant operational asset for Russian forces. Both are now out of the picture. And here's why that matters strategically, not just in terms of the individual ship's value. In the past, Russia always had a fallback. Even when Ukraine managed to destroy a Russian air defense system or blow up an ammunition stockpile on the peninsula, Russian forces could resupply, load up equipment from the mainland, ferry it across the strait, replace what was lost. The logistics chain remained intact even when individual assets were destroyed. That is no longer the case. The railway ferries are gone. The landing ships are being taken out. The bridge is under sustained pressure. The land corridor through the south is being struck at its depots and hubs. Ukraine is not just attacking Russian assets in Crimea, it is systematically dismantling Russia's ability to replace those assets once they are gone. This is the strategic shift that changes everything. Now let's talk about the broader context in which all of this is happening, because the timing matters enormously. Ukraine in 2026 is not the Ukraine of 2022. It is not even the Ukraine of 2024. Its domestic defense industry has undergone a transformation that would have seemed impossible to most analysts 4 years ago. Literally hundreds of defense contractors across the country are working on new innovations: drones, missiles, air defense technologies, electronic warfare systems. Ukraine is not just consuming weapons, it is producing them, refining them in combat, and deploying updated versions at a pace that Russia's aging defense industrial base cannot match. On the ground, the momentum has also shifted in a way that is increasingly difficult for Russia to ignore. February 2026 was the first month since 2023 in which Ukraine's armed forces retook more territory than they lost. That is not a minor milestone. That is a reversal of the directional trend that Russia's entire narrative depended on. The narrative that time was on Russia's side, that slow, grinding forward progress would eventually compound into victory. And Ukraine is about to receive a financial injection that will accelerate everything. The European Union's €90 billion loan, roughly $105 billion, had been blocked by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban for months. But Orban's rule came to an abrupt end after a crushing defeat in the April 12 parliamentary elections. With Orban gone, the loan goes through. That money funds more drones, more missiles, more production capacity, more everything Ukraine needs to maintain and intensify the pressure it is now applying to Crimea and the front lines simultaneously. Russia, meanwhile, is moving in the opposite direction on nearly every metric. Russian forces are advancing at their slowest rate in years. In some frontline areas, they are at a complete standstill. In others, they are being pushed back. The casualty rate continues to be catastrophic. Tens of thousands of troops killed or severely wounded every month. Thousands more deserting or surrendering. And even those who follow orders are being cycled in and out of frontline kill zones so fast that survival is measured in days rather than months. The recruitment situation is deteriorating. Russia's recruitment statistics fell consistently throughout the first quarter of 2026, while its casualty rate climbed. The army is getting smaller. The pool of experienced soldiers is shrinking. The replacements are less trained, less motivated, and less equipped than the men they are replacing. And with Orban gone, Putin has lost one of the only political allies he had within the NATO alliance and the European Union, the man who had been blocking the loan to Ukraine, blocking stronger EU positions, providing rhetorical cover at every turn. That political shield is gone. And what Putin has to show for the years he spent cultivating it is a Ukraine that is stronger, better armed, better funded, and more strategically positioned than at any point since the full-scale invasion began. Let's pull all of this together, because when you see it as a complete picture rather than a series of individual events, the strategic logic becomes clear. Ukraine has spent 12 years, since 2014, running an incremental campaign against Russia's position in Crimea. Every attack that seemed isolated was connected. Every strike that seemed opportunistic was planned. Every asset destroyed, every air defense system, every radar, every ammunition depot, every ship was a piece removed from a structure that Russia believed was permanent. Now, in 2026, Ukraine is entering the phase where those accumulated degradations start to produce compounding consequences. The railway ferries are gone. The landing ships are being struck. The supply depots and logistics hubs along the land corridor are under consistent attack. The Crimean Bridge has been hit 3 times, and according to Lieutenant General Hodges, is going to fall. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which has already been forced out of Sevastopol by repeated Ukrainian strikes, is no longer the dominant presence in the Black Sea it was in 2022. Russian air defense coverage over the peninsula has been stripped down substantially. Russian ammunition reserves on the peninsula are under pressure. And behind all of this, Russia's ability to replace what it loses is degrading. Fewer ferries, fewer landing ships, a bridge that is increasingly targeted and increasingly vital, a land corridor that is watched by Ukrainian drones and struck at its key nodes. If Ukraine succeeds in fully isolating Crimea, cutting off the bridge, eliminating the remaining sea crossings, interdicting the land routes, the Russian forces remaining on the peninsula become exactly what any military commander would recognize as a vulnerable, isolated garrison, cut off from resupply, unable to be reinforced, facing an enemy whose drone and missile capabilities improve every month. At that point, Ukraine does not necessarily need to mount a large-scale ground assault. An isolated garrison under sustained aerial and missile pressure with degrading supplies and no reinforcement path eventually runs out of options. History is full of examples of fortified positions that fell not because they were overwhelmed by frontal assault, but because they were cut off and left to wither. And if Ukraine can eventually forge a pathway through Kherson into the Crimean Peninsula, exploiting the weakness that isolation creates, it could someday send its own soldiers in to reclaim what was taken in 2014. That may seem distant, but consider how distant the current situation would have seemed to someone watching the 2022 invasion. The Black Sea Fleet driven from Sevastopol, the Crimean Bridge struck 3 times, every railway ferry across the Kerch Strait eliminated, Russian forces bleeding out along front lines that refused to break, a European Union loan of $105 billion about to land in Kyiv's accounts, and a retired American general saying without hesitation that the bridge is going to come down. None of that was inevitable in 2022. All of it is happening in 2026. Putin opened a bottle of champagne in 2014. He stood on that bridge in 2018 and drove across it in a truck to celebrate what he had built. He called Crimea sacred. He called it inseparable. He called it forever. He did not understand who he was dealing with. He did not understand that the country he took that peninsula from was going to spend the next 12 years building the capability to take it back. He did not understand that every attack on Sevastopol, every missile into the Black Sea Fleet, every ferry disabled on the Kerch Strait was not a nuisance. It was a step in a strategy that was always pointing toward the same destination, the de-Russification of Crimea. It will not happen overnight. It will not be a single dramatic moment. It will be the continued, patient, methodical application of Ukraine's growing military capability against a Russian position that grows weaker with every passing week. But the trajectory is clear. The pieces are in position. And the bridge, the $4 billion symbol of Putin's certainty that he had won, is eventually going to come down. He thought he'd secured Crimea for generations. He is finding out how wrong he was. I'm Flash America. If this gave you the real strategic picture of what is happening in Crimea right now, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. This campaign is moving fast, and I'm going to cover every development as it happens. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Crimean Bridge falls in 2026? And when it does, what happens to Russia's position on the peninsula? I'll see you in the next one.